Good afternoon, Sue.
How are you, John?
Hey,
Great.
okay. Hi, Sue.
Hello, Fred. How are you?
Good, good.
Good afternoon, Fred.
Hi, John. You guys are always the first ones there.
Well, we don't want to be late, Fred. We were
Yeah.
taught that's the
Okay,
way life should
right.
be. Don't be
Right.
late.
That's correct.
Okay.
And John, we end up waiting for everybody else, don't we?
That's right.
How's your weather, John?
Actually, we've had a lot of stormy weather today, but the holiday was wonderful. It's clear and all that. But the Midwest has just been racked with tornadoes. Horrible loss of life. I read one article in Texas. It's the worst loss of life in weather conditions since 1915.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. All headed your way, unfortunately.
No, actually, our weather's been lovely. It's 80 degrees and sunny.
Yeah. No, what I'm saying, the weather system is headed your way.
Yeah, but we typically don't in Massachusetts have to have tomatoes. We have tomatoes, but we don't have tornadoes. So I'm not. I mean, we've had a lot of rain, but
Yeah, have you?
Yeah.
not recently. They're refinishing our parking lot, and it's been fascinating to watch. It's a horrible mess, but it's been so interesting to see what they do and how they do it, and all the heavy equipment they have to bring in and so on.
Oh,
And
yeah.
they're still working.
Yeah. Wait, is it asphalt or concrete?
No, it's asphalt.
Yeah. Well, that moves along pretty quickly.
Where do
How
you
long
think
have they been working on it?
they just started this morning.
Oh, okay. Well, you got to be careful. Don't go out there and try to walk on it until
No,
I get back.
I'm not planning on it. They have it's a real issue because they have to restage everybody's cars, and you can't get into the garages, and it's been an organizational nightmare, I'm sure, for the staff here.
Oh,
But
yeah.
and my daughter is coming for dinner probably around 6:30, and I don't know where she's going to park.
Well, she'll probably have to walk.
She doesn't mind that.
Is it hilly where you are?
Well, we happen to be up on a fairly high, it's why it's called North Hill. We happen to be up fairly high, but where the majority of the community is relatively flat. If you had to walk up from the main road, it's a pretty steep road.
Yeah.
But once you get up here to the facility, it's pretty flat.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's good.
We seem to have an elite group tonight.
Yeah, it looks like it. I see
Where
Rachel's
is
here.
everybody? Rachel, you're here. Where is everybody?
Um,
Uh, we have a friend staying with us. He was just diagnosed with cancer. And so he's staying with us to recover. And Chris took him to town to visit his dad, who has macular degeneration and can't get to us.
Yeah.
So they should be back any minute, but yeah.
Okay. I have a feeling some of this may be due to the fact we're recording it now. A lot of people may just be, getting the recording and not bothering to come in person. We'll have to see how that. We may have to stop recording if that's a trend. Anyway, let's go ahead and get started. We were going to talk tonight about the Ashkenazic Jews. These are the Jews of most of Europe outside of Spain and Portugal. Um, the reference in the reading list is number 7 on the reading list. It's Constantine's Sword. And Constantine's Sword is a big book, and it takes a while to get through it, but I think it's really worth it. I think more than any other book I've ever read, it really explains why anti-Semitism is so deeply baked into Western culture. It's more than any other book. I think it comes closer to explaining that. So it is well worth reading. Um,
Are you going to talk about that?
yes, we will as we get
Okay,
into this.
okay.
Yeah. These Jews were the Jews outside of Spain and Portugal were called Ashkenazim, and the word Ashkenaz actually comes from the Bible. It's the story of Noah. Supposedly all the nations of the world were descended from Noah's 3 sons. So the Semites, the people of the Middle East, were descended from Shem, and the Africans were descended from Ham, and the Europeans were descended from Japhet, his other son. And that story is followed by one of these biblical genealogies, one of these lists of begots. And one of Japhet's grandsons is called Ashkenaz. And originally, Ashkenaz was applied only to the area that became Germany, but then gradually the rabbis applied it to all of Europe outside of the Iberian Peninsula, outside of Spain and Portugal. So this is how the Ashkenazic Jews got their name. Um, and they had a very different life from the Sephardic Jews. Um, they were excluded pretty much from feudal society because feudal society really involved this hierarchical structure where you owed loyalty to somebody above you, and then you were responsible for someone below you. And these ranks in society were sealed with religious oaths the Jews couldn't take. So they really didn't fit into the feudal system at all. They were excluded from farming mainly because they were not allowed to hire Christian servants. They couldn't hire hands to help on the farm. And they were excluded from the guilds because most of the guilds, the various arts and crafts, were really organized along religious lines. They all had patron saints and they all had various celebrations at various times of year that were religious. And so Jews were excluded from that. So they were really outside the main structure of society. In most areas of Europe, they were simply considered the property of the king. The king was responsible for them. He decided, what would be done with them, whether they were allowed to live in his kingdom or not, or what conditions that they would basically live in. And
Fred,
as a result of that, yes.
Fred, you mentioned initially about the feudal organization. Could you just speak
Mhm.
a few minutes about that? Because I can understand the guilds, because the guilds were really, it appears to me that the guilds were formed to support and grow the physical church.
Many of them were, yes, yes.
That was kind of the nature of the guilds. But the
Hmm.
feudal system, I thought that there were it was more nation state or states or small geographies that had somebody that was a prince or royalty or
Hmm.
third, second cousin of somebody that
Right.
controlled that geography, and everybody was subject to what that person uh, deemed necessary to do, and it was generally
Yeah.
agriculturally based.
But it went down in rank, though. The prince might be at the top of the pyramid. Below him would be several barons, people he'd given grants of land to, and so they owed him loyalty. If he
Right.
had to fight a war, they had to come and bring armed men with them. They would have other people beholden to them. For instance, the people who grew their food, the serfs,
Hmm.
their blacksmiths, their horse trainers, their armorers. And so that they owed loyalty to their lord, who in turn was responsible for protecting them.
Right.
And so, and all these were sealed with religious oaths, which Jews were pretty much cut out of. So they really didn't fit into the system, really. Um, again, since they were cut out of society, the main achievements were really religious. If you think about what did the medieval Ashkenazic Jews produce? Usually the first name that comes up is Rashi, the great Talmud and Bible commentator. There were several other great rabbis, but that's really about it. Where the Sephardic Jews, produced courtiers, poets, physicians, even generals, diplomats. The Ashkenazi Jews didn't have any of that. All they had really was their religion, and all of their achievements were really basically in religious scholarship.
Ah,
That was the
okay.
one thing that they really focused everything into. Um, and the organization of Europe really began, the church really began with Constantine. And at the beginning of the fourth century, the empire, which was kind of starting its decline by then, was breaking up into pieces with various people fighting over who was going to be emperor. And after a series of wars, Constantine, I think the year was around 303 or 304, if I remember right, but he had defeated two of his three rivals. And there was a battle outside of Rome, which would finally decide who would govern the Roman Empire. This was his last great battle. And on the morning of the battle, Constantine announced to his troops that he had had a dream the night before. He had seen a cross illuminated in the sky, and under it in Latin letters was in hoc signo vinces. Under this sign you will conquer. And so he announced to his troops that they were going to fight this battle as a Christian army. That he had seen the truth. He was going to become a Christian himself, and Christianity would be the banner under which his army would fight. Now, historians have been arguing forever about how sincere that was. Whether he really was a religious man, whether he really believed in the Christian faith, or whether he was simply using that as something to try to unite his troops and raise morale. He may have suspected a large part of his army may have been closet Christians, and this was a way to say, I'm a Christian too, and we're fighting this as a Christian army. So it may have been mainly a political ploy. We'll never really know. Um, but they fought that battle as a Christian army and won. And so Constantine became emperor of the United Roman Empire again for a while. And in a few years later, he announced that Christianity would be what he called the preferred religion of the Roman Empire. He didn't say it was the only religion. He said other religions would still be allowed, but Christianity would be the preferred religion. I mean, everybody got the message pretty quickly. If you wanted to advance in the government, if you did business with the government, if you wanted to move up the ranks of the army, it was better to be a Christian. And that led, to mass conversion to Christianity all through the empire. In fact, Constantine is also really responsible for giving Christianity its symbol. There was no agreed on symbol for Christianity before Constantine. He was the one who made the cross the symbol of Christianity. And there were several other symbols that were kind of contending for that. One was water, the idea of water of life that the scriptures talks about. But water is very hard to do as a logo. Another suggestion, it really is,
Yeah.
Another suggestion was the fish. And actually, you still see this today. I mean, I don't know about in Texas or Oklahoma, but in South Carolina, you see cars all the time that have this image of the fish, on them. And the fish was significant in that in Greek, fish is ichthys, and it's spelled iota chi theta sigma, which in Greek could read Jesu Christe Theotokos Soter, Jesus Christ, God bearer, Savior. And it was an easy symbol that Christians could make to identify each other, especially at times when they were being persecuted. So that was one popular idea. The other, which I kind of would have voted for, was the dove. And this comes from the episode in the Gospels where John the Baptist baptizes Jesus. The skies open and a dove comes down, and God says, "This is my servant, in whom I am well pleased." And the dove would have, I think, have been a great symbol. And actually, in the Catholic tradition, it's still used. It's called the Paraclete, and it symbolizes the Holy Spirit and the Trinity. And if you go into a traditional Catholic church, you will often see images of the dove woven into the altar cloth or into the priest's vestment. But the one that finally made it really was the cross. And it was really mainly due to Constantine. And I think he probably picked it because here you are, there was an army out in the field. You didn't have any graphic designers handy to design something for you. And a cross was really simple. You could chalk it or paint it on a shield. You could take a lance and put a stick across it, to make a cross to carry into battle. And so that became the official symbol of Christianity. One of the things that bothered Constantine about Christianity, though, and it was really pretty unorganized in his time. We think of the Catholic Church as being this rigid, hierarchical uh, system with the Pope at the top, but that took centuries to develop. In the fourth century, basically every congregation pretty much did what it wanted. There really was no official creed. The only two sacraments that everybody kind of agreed on were baptism and communion, not the seven sacraments that the church eventually developed. And the cities actually elected their own bishops. The Bishop of Rome at that time was just another bishop. He didn't have the authority that popes later on were given. And so basically, Constantine felt that if the church was going to be useful for him as a unifying force in his empire, the church had to show him that it was really ready for prime time. It had to get itself together, develop an organized creed and a structure. And so in 325, he called a council of the entire church at Nicaea, which is where sort of in the south of where modern Turkey is. And the Nicene Council actually met on and off for over 10 years after that. And they really were more responsible than any other thing in the ancient world for organizing the Christian church. They came up, first of all, with the Nicene Creed, which is still a basic statement of faith in most Christian denominations. They set the date for Easter, which different people were celebrating at different times up until then. They also felt very strongly that they had to separate themselves from Judaism, because they thought that Judaism and Christianity were still too entangled, and that it was time for the church to make a clean break with Judaism. So one of the things they did was change the Christian Sabbath to Sunday, so it would not be the same day as the Jewish Sabbath, the Saturday. That's the origin, really, of Sunday as the Christian Sabbath. And there were a variety of other rules that they made. One was that Jews could not employ Christian servants. And one of the reasons was to be a servant in a Jewish household, you had to know a little bit about Judaism. You had to know what could be done and not be done on the Sabbath. You had to know which foods couldn't be mixed together, if you're working in the kitchen. And so the problem was that a lot of these, even with this basic orientation, a lot of Christian servants really found Judaism very attractive and converted. And the church had to put a stop to that. So that was one rule that they made. There was even one interesting rule that prohibited Christians from eating matzah during Holy Week, which kind of shows you how still entwined the two religions were, that you still had Christians eating matzah during Holy Week. And again, it's really not known how much of a real Christian Constantine was. He never actually got around to being baptized till he was on his deathbed. His mother, though, was a very devout Christian. And if you've ever visited Jerusalem, one of the major Christian holy sites is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which the Empress Helena, Constantine's mother, had built. So she was a very devout Christian. Whether Constantine really was or was just using the church as a political tool, historians are really still arguing about. But he really was more responsible than anyone else for organizing the church in the way that it eventually developed. In the 5th century, one of the primary leaders in medieval Christianity was Saint Ambrose, who was the Bishop of Milan. And he came up with the idea that all the Jews of Europe should be killed. which it was really the first serious suggestion anyone had ever made in Europe for a Holocaust. And his reasoning really was pretty simple. If Christianity was the one true religion, it was the one truth, and everything else was error, why should the truth tolerate error? Why keep the Jews around? Either they were too blind to see that Jesus was the Messiah, or they did see that, and they were just too stubborn and perverse to admit it. And in either case, Europe would be better off without them. Fortunately, he was talked out of that by his favorite student, who was St. Augustine. And St. Augustine's approach was don't kill them. But again, don't let them thrive either. So the idea is they would survive but not thrive. They would be kept in a low condition in society, and so that way they could serve as living witnesses to people who didn't accept Jesus as the Messiah. Um, and this is pretty much how Jews lived really in medieval Europe. They were set aside in ghettos. Every city had a Jewish quarter where the Jews lived by themselves in the ghetto. Often they were made to wear specific clothing that would identify them as Jews, so Christians would know to avoid them if they saw them on the street during the day. In fact, the yellow star, which we associate with the Nazis and the Holocaust, really was a product of the medieval church. That they started using them at around the 5th or 6th century, so to mark Jews as being apart, from Christian society. But even with that, Jewish life was not all that bad in Europe, and in many places they didn't do too badly. One of the major turning points came with the Crusades, which began toward the end of the 11th century. Um, and the Crusades had a number of reasons for them. One was that the papacy had been developing gradually over the years, and the popes were looking for a way to assert themselves as the leaders of all of Europe. There was when Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. Both the church and the empire influenced each other. To a significant extent, the church Christianized the empire. They were able to get rid of a lot of the worst aspects of Roman life. For one thing, they got rid of crucifixion. Obviously, you didn't want to have a house of worship with a cross on top of it, as a symbol, while people were hanging on real crosses, in another part of town. So one of the good things about Constantine choosing the cross as the Christian symbol is he put an end to crucifixion as a method of execution. The church managed to put an end to the gladiatorial games. They managed to put an end to throwing convicted criminals to wild animals. With the babies that were being literally thrown away if they were unwanted, the churches built orphanages and hospitals. So the church went a long way into Christianizing Roman life and into softening a lot of the more brutal aspects of Roman culture. But the influence ran the other way. Over the long run, the empire imperialized the church. And toward the 11th century, there were a lot of popes who really thought that it was the church that should rule England. Because again, there was no secular power that ruled. Europe was broken up into small, feudal places where various barons and princes ruled. But the church was the only supranational institution in all of Europe. And it made sense to the Pope. So the Pope really should be the head of Europe. And crusade really seemed to be really a good tool for doing that. Because here you would have the Pope standing at the head of the United Christian Europe and directing a crusade to liberate Jerusalem from the Muslim infidels, that were holding it at the time. If there had been cameras in the 11th century, that would have been the perfect photo op. The Pope announcing this great crusade that would unite all of Christian Europe. Um, and it played into what the popes wanted, which was a totally Christian world with the Pope at its head.
Fred,
Yeah.
about this same period, what about all the Germanic tribes that were also coming in from the north and beginning to have
Yes.
influence and also conflict with what was left
Mhm.
of the Roman Church, and as a Christian
Mhm.
church was beginning to expand. They
Well,
weren't, they
most of
were
them,
pagans.
they were, but most of them converted to Christianity.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they did. Yeah, Europe was pretty much Christianized by the fifth or sixth century. There were still some holdouts, particularly in Scandinavia and in northern Germany. You know, there were still pagan ceremonies being carried out in northern Europe. But most of these tribes that took over the Western Roman Empire when it finally fell apart actually took up Christianity. They became Christians. And of course, there were some secondary reasons also for the Crusades. For one thing, it was a way to deal with the feudal nobility, because the feudal nobility really didn't have any real place in society. Their only real task in society was to fight. You could drain off some of that energy with hunting and tournaments and whatnot, but they really were destructive force. They were constantly fighting each other, and this was a way, in a sense, to get them out of town and let them plunder somebody else's country, off to the east. So a lot of people were glad to see them leave, on a crusade.
Mm.
It got rid of some of the constant fighting that was going on. Also, one of the problems with the feudal system is that if you were a prince or a baron or an earl, your oldest son inherited the title and the estate. The younger sons had to find some other way to make a living. And if you
Ah,
were if you
okay.
were an aristocrat, it was considered below your station to engage in business or commerce. The only two things that really were considered proper for an aristocrat were either the church or else the army. And so this gave younger sons a chance to go out and fight and maybe even get their own kingdom, somewhere out in the Middle East. The same thing pretty much happened to the British, during the 19th century with the British Empire. The oldest son got the title and got the estate. The younger sons, either way, if you were a younger son, you could become a vicar in the Anglican Church, be a vicar for the family church, or you could be a colonel in the family regiment, go into the army, or you could go into the colonial service and help run Kenya or Uganda or Burma or India. In fact, there's some historians who really have the theory that the main function of the British Empire was really as a jobs program for the younger sons of the aristocracy. It gave them something to do. But this was one of the things that was really behind the Crusades also. And also there were a lot of ordinary people who really went for religious reasons. They really believed that God willed them to go off to the Middle East and rescue the Holy Land, from the Muslim infidel. So the First Crusade began in 1096. Pope Urban II preached it, and it turned out to be a disaster. A lot of the aristocracy didn't sign up for it, and so it was really a poorly led mob. And one of the first things they thought is, why go off to the Middle East to kill infidels when we have infidels right here at home? And one of the things they did before leaving for the Middle East was to pretty much wipe out all the Rhineland Jewish communities. There were widespread massacres, all in places like Strasbourg, Cologne, Spiers, Mainz. All of these Rhineland Jewish communities, where most of them were almost totally wiped out during this First Crusade.
Mm.
Many Jews really who were given the choice between conversion or death actually chose martyrdom. And this is really, when you think about it, is in contrast with the Sephardic Jews. When Spain became Christianized again, and the Sephardic Jews were given choice between conversion, leaving Spain, or death, many of them chose to convert. Thousands of them. They either became sincere converts or they became Marranos, who outwardly converted but secretly continued to practice Judaism. Whereas the Ashkenazi Jews, many of them preferred martyrdom, preferred to die rather than to give up the religion. And it really was a reflection of the different life experiences of these two different communities. The Sephardic Jews really had made it in the Muslim Sephardic society. they had a lot to lose. They had a stake in society. The Ashkenazi Jews really had nothing but their religion. They really had no stake in feudal society. They were outcasts. All they had really was the religion, and they would rather die than give that up. And you even see that carrying over into the modern world. The Sephardic Jews today are mostly Orthodox. Reform Judaism, to them is a German import that they never really bought into. But it's a really kind of relaxed kind of orthodoxy. They're not really zealous about it. The really fanatic ultra Orthodox Jews, the ones with the black hats and the long beards and the black coats, they're almost all Ashkenazic. And it really reflects their experience. To these Ashkenazic Jews for centuries, all they had was the religion. Whereas the Sephardic Jews, not that they didn't value the religion, but they had a lot of other things, to occupy them in society. And it's reflected even today of Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews. The Second Crusade was in 1144, and this time it wasn't so bad. One of the leaders, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, uh, who was one of the leaders of the Crusade, really told his bishops to try to protect the Jews in the various cities of Europe from the Crusaders. Not that he really liked the Jews, but he thought it was making the church look bad. All these massacres going on in Europe. So that wasn't as destructive. The Third Crusade, which is really the one which probably people know most about, because this is one that Richard the Lionheart of England led, fighting Saladin. This is one of the ones that most of the books are written about and the movies are made about. But the problem was when Richard left England, a lot of his nobles who owed money to the Jews decided the simplest way to cancel their debts was to get rid of the Jews. And so there was widespread massacres all through England of the English Jews. And this was really almost the end of the English Jewish community, pretty much until the 17th century when Oliver Cromwell let them back. And of course, the Crusaders, when they did take Jerusalem, although they didn't hold it, for very long, when they did take Jerusalem, all the Jews and Muslims of Jerusalem were massacred, when Jerusalem fell. And the aftermath, Christian attitudes basically was demonization of the Jews. They were really the only other in European society. Most Europeans, if they had not gone crusading, had never seen a Muslim, had never heard of Hinduism or Buddhism or any religions outside of Christianity and Judaism. So the only others in Christian society were the Jews. And there were a variety of approaches the church took toward them. You could preach to them, try to bring them around by persuasion. You could apply social and economic pressure, try to make their lives miserable enough that they would give up Judaism and come across, or expel or kill them. And all of these things were used at one time or another. The rules about the ghetto became stricter. In many parts of Europe, the Jews literally were locked into the ghetto. The ghetto had gates, which were locked at night. And so it became a prison, really, during the night. Jews might be allowed out during the day, if they had business in the outside city. They were forced to wear the yellow star and various other special clothing to mark them apart. One of the things that became part of Christian culture was the accusation of ritual murder. And this was the story that at every Passover, Jews would kidnap Christian children, kill them, and use their blood to make matzah. And the fact that obviously blood is not used in making matzahs, and Jews are forbidden as part of the dietary laws to use blood in cooking, didn't seem to matter. This was widely believed. And there were especially bad pogroms, usually around Easter, because the rumor always started around Easter, that some Christian child had been kidnapped and the Jews had killed it, to use it in their Passover rituals. You can still see, if you read the Canterbury Tale, read the Pardoner's Tale, and that tells the story of a little boy named Hugh of Lincoln who was kidnapped by a gang of Jews and killed. So it was still very much alive in Chaucer's time. when he wrote the Canterbury Tales. And you see it today, even in the modern Muslim world. The interesting thing about Muslim anti-Semitism is they're not very original. They really can't come up with their own original anti-Semitic tropes. They have to borrow it from medieval Europe. And you still see, Muslims who claim that in the Middle East, who claim that the Jews kill Muslim or Christian children around Passover time. In the 14th century, when the bubonic plague, the Black Death, decimated Europe, naturally the Jews were blamed for it. The Jews were poisoning the well, and this was the source of the Black Death, as far as the church was concerned. Even though Jews died at about the same rate as Christians did, during the plague. And then there was the belief that Jews actually tortured communion wafers, which sounds kind of bizarre, but you have to remember that in Catholic theology, if you believe that the wafer really is the body of Christ, it was really believed that Jews used to break into churches at night, steal the communion wafers, and torture them. Actually torturing Jesus, and so uh, this really persisted almost into the modern era. The Jewish attitudes that this engendered was that no Christian is to be trusted. Don't trust anybody outside of the Jewish community. Jewish behavior has no effect on Christian attitudes. It doesn't do any good to be nice to Christians or to try to befriend them. It's not going to make any difference. And there was this pronounced turning inward. The idea that the only thing to focus on was your own religious life. And again, you see this among the ultra-Orthodox even to this day. They completely turn their backs on secular society. They only focus inwardly on their own community, and they have nothing to do with the outside society. This is still a holdover from medieval Europe. And by the late Middle Ages, Jewish life in Western Europe was pretty much over. They had been expelled from England by Edward I in 1290. They had been expelled from France in 1306. Of course, they had been expelled from Spain in 1492. And so in the late Middle Ages, the last part of the Middle Ages, there really were almost no Jews left in Western Europe. The communities that were left had pretty much migrated toward the east. Okay. One of the hopes that came up during the Reformation, which began in the 16th century when Luther broke with the church, is maybe this new form of Christianity will have a different attitude toward the Jews. There are a lot of Jews who are hoping maybe with the Reformation the church is going to change, and initially there was some hope for that. If you look at page 13 on the outline, if you have the outline, one of the things that Martin Luther wrote in 1523, shortly after he broke with the church, where he said, if I had been a Jew and seen such dolts and blockheads, he was a very colorful writer. He called it like he saw it. If I'd seen such dolts and blockheads govern and teach the Christian faith, I would have sooner been a hog than a Christian. They have dealt with the Jews as if they were dogs rather than human beings. They have done little else but deride them and seize their property. When they baptize them, of course, this is forcible baptism, they show them nothing of Christian doctrine or life, but only subject them to popishness and monkery. If the apostles, who were also Jews, had dealt with us Gentiles as we Gentiles deal with the Jews, there would have never been a Christian among the Gentiles. When we are inclined to boast of our position as Christians, we should remember that we are but Gentiles, while the Jews are of the lineage of Christ. We are aliens and in-laws, they are blood relatives, cousins and brothers of our Lord. Therefore, if one is to boast of flesh and blood, the Jews are actually nearer to Christ than we are. And if we really want to help them, we must be guided in our dealings with them, not by papal law, but by the law of Christian love. We must receive them cordially and permit them to trade and work with us, that they may have occasion and opportunity to associate with us, hear our Christian teaching, and witness our Christian life. And if some of them should prove stiff-necked, what of it? After all, we ourselves are not all good Christians either. Jews reading that really thought, okay, this is a new, improved form of Christianity, and maybe, things are going to be different. But the problem was when many Jews didn't choose to convert to Christianity, Luther turned against them. And one of the last things that he wrote before his death in 1543, a essay called On the Jews and Their Lies, he made a series of suggestions for how the German princes should treat the Jews. He said, first, set fire to their synagogues and schools, and then bury and cover them with dirt, whatever will not burn, so no man will ever see a stone or cinder of them. I advise that their houses also be razed and destroyed. I advise that all their prayer books and Talmudic writings, in which such idolatry, lies, cursing, and blasphemy are taught, be taken from them. I advise that their rabbis be forgiven to teach henceforth on pain of loss of life and limb. I advise that safe conduct on the highways be abolished completely for Jews. I advise that usury should be prohibited to them, and that all cash and treasure of silver and gold be taken from them. I commend putting an axe, a hoe, a stall, a distaff, or spindle in the hands of young, strong Jews and Jewesses, and let them earn their bread in the sweat of their brow. If we wish for to free our hands of the Jews' blasphemy and not share in their guilt, we have to part company with them. They must be driven from our country. We must drive them out as mad dogs. And actually, every one of these suggestions was made part of the Nuremberg laws of 1933, which deprived the Jews of their German citizenship and was really the first step that led to the Holocaust. And, there were two theories about Luther. One was that he genuinely wanted the Jews to convert. He really thought they would convert with his new form of Christianity. And then he was really bitterly disappointed when they didn't and turned against them. The other is that he never liked the Jews and was really using the church's treatment of the Jews as a stick to beat the Catholic Church with. But, if you look at his first writings where he mentions popishness and monkery, so probably what he was really doing is just using the treatment of the Jews as one more thing to beat the church with. And he never really liked the Jews to begin with. That's an ongoing thing. But a lot of historians, German historians, really trace a direct line from Luther to the Holocaust. His teachings really became embedded in German culture and eventually were picked up and used by the Nazis. Any comments or questions at this point? And there were people in the church actually during the Middle Ages who actually spoke out against this, who actually pointed out that the church, in a sense, was shooting itself in the foot by the way that it was treating the Jews. Again, if you read Constantine's Sword, he really goes into that in detail. Jim Carroll actually was a Catholic priest who eventually left the church, and really is a major historian of medieval Christian history. He really gives probably the most detailed account of the debates that went on inside the church as to how the Jews were going to be treated. Okay. Anybody have any questions or comments so far? Well, the question is then, where did the Jews go? Driven out of Western New York? Well, they obviously went east. And east in those days mainly meant Poland. And, we think of Poland today as really a fairly small, not very consequential country in Europe. But in the late Middle Ages, it was really a major power. Poland then was a lot bigger than it is now. To the north, it included what we now call Lithuania. To the south, it included parts of what is now northern Austria. To the east, it included most of what is now Ukraine. So Poland was really a major country then, and Jews immigrated there from several sources. There was immigration from the Black Sea area to the south. Jews were driven north by persecution by the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Byzantine Empire. There were Jews from the Caucasus area, the Khazars, and we talked about that last week. The Khazars were converts to Judaism during the Middle Ages, and of course from the West, from France and Germany and England, they moved east into Poland. One of the advantages they had there was that the church was not well established there yet. Poland was really the last Western European country or Central European country to convert to Christianity. There are actually accounts of Druid ceremonies taking place in forests in Lithuania and northern Poland, even into the 13th or 14th centuries. So the Poles were latecomers to Christianity, which helped. It was kind of ironic, Poland is probably the most Catholic country in the world, certainly in Europe, but not in the world today. But they were latecomers to Christianity. And also the Jagiellon dynasty. Poland was ruled for a couple of centuries, beginning in the 12th century by a family called the Jagiellon family. And the Jagiellons actually welcomed the Jews. They saw Poland as a backward agrarian country, and if it were going to develop, it needed a literate commercial middle class, and the Jews were ideal to fill that function. So they actually welcomed the Jews to Poland. They gave them royal protection. One of the first kings, Boleslaw the Pious, granted a charter to the Jews in 1264, inviting them to settle in Poland and promising them royal protection. Casimir the Great, who was probably the greatest of the Jagiellon kings, at the height of Polish power in the 14th century, reconfirmed the charter for the Jews. The fact that he had a Jewish mistress may have had something to do with it, but he was very, very, very protective of his Jewish subjects. And the Polish Jewish community was really a self-governing community. The Jagiellon kings allowed them to govern themselves in internal matters. For instance, the Jews were not taxed as individuals. The Jewish community was taxed as a community, and the officials of the Jewish community would then decide who paid how much. They would collect it and then give it to the king. And in internal religious affairs, the Jewish community governed itself, and they were really kind of a state within a state. They were given a great deal of internal independence from the monarchy. The Jewish officials who governed the Jewish state is what was called the Council of the Four Lands. And the Four Lands were Lithuania, the Ukraine part of Poland, Galicia, which was southern Poland, and central Poland. And they used to meet several times a year, to decide policy for Jews living in Poland. The Jews there even had their own language, which was Yiddish. And although Yiddish began really in medieval Germany and the Rhineland communities, it really is a combination of a medieval dialect of German with Hebrew. It was taken up by the Polish Jews as their language, which separated them from the rest of the Poles. It was their own internal language. They developed their own educational system, the yeshiva, for religious education. They didn't use the Polish schools at all. And so that they really were a state of their own within a state. But eventually, like all good things, it came to an end. The Jagiellon dynasty died out in 1572, and the Polish nobles then devised what was one of really the strangest systems of government any country has ever had. They decided that there would still be a king, but the monarchy would be elective, not hereditary. The nobility would choose the king. And in the Polish parliament, which was entirely made up of the aristocracy, every nobleman had an absolute veto. In other words, nothing could pass without unanimous consent. It was kind of like the UN Security Council. Every member could veto anything. And so, which the nobility liked, because it meant there was a very weak central government, obviously, and every noble was pretty much sovereign, on his own lands. Of course, it finally led to Poland being taken apart by its neighbors, but because of that weakness. Um, but it also meant that Poland really had taken a step back into the Middle Ages, where every nobleman really was his own government. Um, the problem the Jews had is that the Polish nobility often used them to manage their estate. The Jews were used as kind of economic middlemen. And the Polish aristocracy were pretty much like aristocrats everywhere. They were deeply allergic to work. And so if you were a Polish nobleman, you could spend your time drinking and partying in Warsaw or Paris while your Jewish agents ran your estate for you. And that led to a lot of trouble for the Jews, because one of the things that the Polish nobility did is to really treat the Ukrainian peasants really badly. They were the serfs really who worked on the Polish estates, and the Ukrainians were Christian, but they were Eastern Orthodox Christians. They had been Christianized by the Greek Orthodox Church, and the Poles tried to forcibly convert them to Roman Catholicism. The Ukrainians also had a very kind of semi-nomadic lifestyle, the Cossack lifestyle, but they didn't like to be tied down to villages. They moved from place to place. The Poles bound them down as serfs on their estates and really treated them badly. And so they developed a deep Ukrainian hatred of the Poles. And of course, for most Ukrainian peasants, more often than not, the actual face of Polish oppression was the Jewish face. The people they dealt with on a daily basis on the Polish estates were the Jewish managers and agents for these estates. So that developed a very deep hatred of Ukrainians for Jews, which really carried over even into modern times. During the Second World War, when Germany invaded Poland and Ukraine and Russia, many of the Ukrainians joined with the Nazis. They had a long history of hating Jews in Ukraine, which really makes it all the more really amazing that today Ukraine has a Jewish president. It's amazing how the Ukraine has evolved over the years from one of the most anti-Semitic areas of Europe into what it is today. But it eventually led up to a disaster in 1648. A Cossack a leader named Bogdan Khmelnytsky led a revolt of the Ukrainians against the Poles. And because, again, the Polish state was so weak, without a strong central leadership, it took years to bring it under control. And large parts of Poland, particularly in the south, were decimated. And the Jews were a particular target of that. Ukrainian hatred of the Jews had been building up over decades. It's estimated over 100,000 Jews probably died during the 1648 revolt. And Jewish life in the South was really devastated. And there were a number of things that came out of this. One was there was a renewed interest in Kabbalah and mysticism. Jews turned even more toward the inside, toward religious mysticism. And in fact, in the 1660s, one of the huge scandals in Jewish life, a man named Shabbatai Tzvi, really a Turkish Jew, announced, who was known, very charismatic guy. He had a large following in Turkey. He also had very strange moods. He would actually lock himself in his room for days at a time, simply studying Kabbalah, then would come out and then would give these lectures and rallies with his supporters. He probably is what we would call manic depressive today. That's what a lot of the biographies make him seem like. But a lot of Jews believed him. He announced one day that he was the Messiah, and he was going back to Jerusalem to establish his kingdom there, and he invited all the Jews of Europe to join him. And there were thousands and thousands of Jews who actually did, sold everything they had, and got ready to move into Palestine, in anticipation of the Messiah setting up his kingdom there. And he actually moved to to Jerusalem in 1666, announced himself as the Messiah, had crowds gather all around him, and the Muslim rulers of course, this was part of the Ottoman Empire by this time, and the Ottoman Sultan heard about him and summoned him to Istanbul. He was curious about what it was all about, and when he finally met Shabbatai Tzvi, he pretty much thought he was probably a harmless lunatic, and decided to imprison him for a while. And the terms of his imprisonment were really pretty easy. He was given a fairly comfortable place to live. It was really house arrest. People were allowed to visit him. So he really, people made pilgrimages to Istanbul to pay homage to him. He kept up this idea that he was the Messiah. Finally, around 16, I think it was around 1669 or 70, the Sultan had decided that he was becoming too popular. And he finally decided to put an end to it. He gave Shabbatai Tzvi the choice between conversion to Islam or death. And Shabbatai converted right away, and the whole thing collapsed. It's one of the greatest scams in Jewish history. The other thing that came out of it, though, that had a lasting effect, especially in southern Poland, was Hasidism. Hasidism was really born at the beginning of the 18th century in the wake of all the devastation that went on in Poland. The north of Poland, the Lithuanian part, was spared most of that. And that's where the great Talmudic academies developed. The south of Poland really had nothing like that. Jews had very little leadership. They really lived pretty miserable lives after the devastation of Ukrainian massacres. And this is really where Hasidism developed in the early years of the 18th century. That really is kind of a subject all by itself. So I'm going to leave it for next week. We can pick up there with the beginning of Hasidism. Anybody have any questions or comments?
Fred,
Yeah.
we always look at that time period through kind of the prism of the United States and the prism that we have. But
Mhm.
this whole feudal system that existed, the structure wasn't as organized, I don't think, as what we kind of look at ourselves as. And there were
Mhm.
strong little power places, there were weak. And when you talk about Poland and shifting to Ukraine and all these different areas, there wasn't a nationalism per se. It was more the guy on top. He had these
Mhm.
alliances that he would build with people around him, but the people
Right.
on bottom, they were in subsistence. Their real concern was to where they're going to get something to eat.
Exactly. Yeah. The idea of a nation state really didn't come till late in the
Yeah,
18th century. The European Enlightenment. Basically there were no such things as Frenchmen or Germans in the sense that we understand it today.
right.
So it was very very different kind of system.
But I have a hard time trying to figure out how the Jewish population fit in all of these cracks and crevices of these little
Mhm.
empires.
Yeah. Well, they didn't really fit. The problem really was, they sort of belonged to whoever the ruler was, whether he was a king or a duke or whatever. And they lived really at his pleasure. They had no individual rights. They weren't citizens of a country. The Jews were there as long as they were useful. When they were not useful, for instance, if you had borrowed a lot of money from them and you were having trouble paying it back, well, one way is to simply expel them from your area. You could
Mhm.
then burn all the financial records, and that was the end of it.
Yeah.
So, in fact, that happened in France over and over again. They were expelled, allowed to come back, expelled again, allowed to come back. In fact, one French historian said the Jews were kind of like a sponge. You squeeze them dry, put them away again when they were back, wet again, squeeze them dry again, then let them go again. It was, they were basically, and since nobody really had any rights, what we call being a citizen of a country,
Yeah,
and having constitutional rights was a totally unknown
nobody had any
concept.
rights.
Yeah, that didn't come really until near the end of the 18th century
Yeah.
anywhere. So, your fate really depended on your personal relationship with who was the top of the pyramid,
Yeah,
where you were. There are places like in Poland, the Jews really had a great time for about a century and a half with the Jagiellon monarchy. But then, when that broke up, things started to decline. It really just depended on the mood of whoever was running the show at the time.
yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, next week we'll pick up with the beginning of Hasidism in Poland. I think we'll see how many people show up. If we're the only ones again, we may have to stop recording. That may not have been a good idea.
Well, I certainly have enjoyed it, Fred, and this has been
I
just so
yeah,
educational. Yeah,
it's absolutely been marvelous, Fred.
yeah.
Okay. Okay. See you
Okay.
guys next week.
Have a
Okay,
great week,
thank you.
all.
Thanks.
Okay. Bye. Okay.